All right, Matt and Lizzie, let's go ahead and get started.
All right, hi everybody. Today we will once again hear from two speakers, Dominic Winski and Brian McGill. But first, we're going to give a summary of each of last week's presentations. First, we heard from Nicholas Whiteman, who presented on the examination of fluid-solid interactions with smooth particle hydrodynamics. Specifically, his research focuses on coastal erosion, and fluid-solid interactions are a vital aspect of climate change research, especially as we face rising sea level and more intense storms. Using dual S physics, a high-resolution 3D modeling code, Nicholas was able to produce visual representations of fluid turbulence, vorticity, velocity, erosional behavior, and other fluid-solid interactions. As future research may combine his models with other mesoscale climate records to inform local fluid-solid interactions, and additionally, photogrammetry can be used to model specific real-world locations. So thanks for that presentation and the really wonderful graphics that were included with it. Next, Lizzie is going to give a summary of the other presenter last week.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. So we also heard from Lynn Kaluzensky last week, whose research focuses on modeling the Ross ice shelf and its sensitivity to changes along its western lateral margin. She presented large-scale Ross ice shelf dynamics and highlighted modeling studies. And Lynn combined observations of melt with previous modeling work. And the implication is that this western lateral margin is the key area of the vulnerability. And Lynn traveled to the western lateral margin of the ice shelf over several seasons. Over many years, she collected GPS and radar data. And the results of study are that the GPS show that the ice thickness is greatly mated with the BedMap2 dataset, which has been widely used in many modeling studies. She compared models initialized by BedMap2 and BedMachine, find which is closer to ice thickness estimates. And the flux across the grounding line is sensitive to ice thickness initialization, and care is needed along the ice shelf shear margin in particular. Relative thickness change is the greatest indicator of resultant change in flux across the grounding line, but does not capture the entire picture. And on the end, the large-scale observations of marine ice location thickness and the density are needed to improve ice thickness estimates. And so with that, I will go ahead and introduce our first speaker today, Dominic Winski. He will be presenting stable water isotope and snow accumulation records from North Pacific ice cores. So Dominic, go ahead.
Great, thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can I get a thumbs up if this is all looking good? Thanks, Dan. Okay, so it's my pleasure to talk to you all today about some of the work that myself and my colleagues have been doing in the Alaska range and in the North Pacific in general on our ice cores here. And I think the first time that I gave a talk at Bournes was 11 years ago, and it was actually, the subject material was from almost right here at this very site. So certainly our work has come a long way since that time, and I'm happy to present it to you. So today I'm going to be talking about specifically the stable water isotopes, which is a proxy for air mass and moisture movement. This is one of the oldest proxies in ice cores. People have been working with it for a while, but it's pretty new to me. So these, I'll sort of give away the punchline, and that is that this is a work in progress, and I'm not going to be presenting too many conclusions, but just more of an update. So anyway, I'll get started. One of the first things I want to do is just acknowledge the fact that this project has been going on for ages, really ever since I was a kid, long before I thought I was going to get involved with this. So there are a whole lot of people here who have been directly involved in the data sets that I'll be showing. And I just
sorry to break in, but we're seeing a bunch of data, but we're not seeing people. Is that what you're meaning to be showing us?
Oh no, I am not. Let me see if I can fix that. Thank you, Dan.
And thanks to Hannah for pointing it out in the chat.
Yeah, let's see. Can you see, I think I've stopped my share. I apologize for that.
That looks better.
And now
Sorry.
can you see the actual slideshow itself?
We can now, yeah. So we could see your screen before, which is what I gave you the
But
thumbs up for,
just-
but it didn't realize it wasn't what you wanted us to see. Thank you.
Okay, well, hopefully this is better.
Yes.
And now can you see the next slide? Okay, excellent. I apologize for that. So now you can sort of see the landscape that I've been talking about. And I will sort of continue onwards. So this is, I just was here acknowledging sort of all the collaborators that have been working on this particular project over the decades at this point that it's been going on. So why are we interested so much in collecting ice cores and understanding the moisture and air mass movement in sort of the North Pacific region? So there are a few reasons for this. Probably one of the most obvious and is just there are a lot of glaciers here and they're melting really, really fast and contributing as much as a third, depending on which estimates you're using, of sea level rise from mountain glaciers, which is a globally significant amount that affects everyone around the world, really. So we want to understand how climate in this area is affecting glaciers. And it's probably no surprise that this is one of the most rapidly warming areas anywhere in the planet, which is of course related to the severe reductions in glacier volume. So we also want to understand what is going on in this region that's leading to such rapid warming. For my part, I'm really interested in the interaction between sort of natural variability in the climate, something like the El Nino Southern Oscillation, with the progressive anthropogenic warming. And this is a really critical spot to look at that because you're right on the border between the Arctic, which is experiencing this sort of runaway acceleration of warming related to greenhouse emissions and their associated feedbacks. But also next to it is the Pacific, which sort of retains some of the most robust natural climate variability anywhere on the planet. So if you want to look at sort of the interactions between some of these climate oscillations that have occurred before humans and some of the big progressive changes that are going on right now, this is a really exciting place to look. And then also a lot of these studies in ice cores have really important applications to populations that live in the region. Both human populations as well as plant and animal populations. And a lot of our work has been used in then subsequent studies to apply to these real problems. So here's a map of Alaska, and on it, I'm showing you several of our different ice core sites. So the red ones are projects led or prominently contributed to by the University of Maine, where we're sort of really pushing them forward. And then there are also others which you might collaborate with. But I'm really going to focus on the long records, which are these four that go for about 1,000 years or so. So as I've mentioned, we've been studying these ice core records for some time in this region, and we've learned quite a bit. So namely, one of the big conclusions is that over the last 100 years or so, there's been this acceleration in warmth, in rainfall, and snow, and in storms entering the Alaska region from the south. And that's been getting more and more prominent with time. So we're seeing, warmer than ever temperatures, but also higher than ever snowfalls up in the mountains, and more intensifying storms. So that's all been well established from various investigators over the last few decades. And one of the questions is, with these big climate changes occurring in this region, we would expect to see something similar going on in the water isotope record. So before I get too much into the water isotope record, I'm just going to give you like a real brief 1-minute primer on sort of water isotopes and ice cores and what they might signify. So this is just a little schematic of the Pacific Ocean. So on the left is the tropics, And on the right is Alaska, with our ice core site being up here on this mountain. So what happens when you evaporate water from, say, the Pacific Ocean, that will go up into a cloud, and that will have a reduced value of water isotopes. It'll essentially be depleted in neutrons, in halfway layman's terms. And then as that air mass moves northward towards our ice core site, it will get progressively more depleted in water isotopes. So that the characteristics like the temperature of your air mass source, or the temperature of your ice core site, or the trajectory that your moisture takes between its source and our ice core site, all will feed into what your final value is that you measure in your ice core. So we would expect, with all these changes that are going on, to see some really remarkable shifts in the value of our water isotopes in the ice core. So here's what it actually looks like. So here is the what's called the Delta 18O record from Denali, and that's just a measure of what I just showed you, basically the depletion of these heavy versus light isotopes in the Denali core. And it goes up and down with these variations, but it does not show this major shift during the 20th century that, say, records of sea salt or temperature or precipitation would have. Not only that, but it's really different from this other record here on Mount Logan nearby, which shows a completely different structure. It has this big shift in the 1800s that's not seen on Denali. And it has sort of different sets of ups and downs, which is not something we would expect, since these cores are really quite close together. I'm going to show a third record, which is now Eclipse, which shows also its own thing. And finally, a fourth record from Bona Churchill, which to my eye looks kind of similar to Denali, but it's also certainly not the same either. So the question here that I am interested in currently, and I've started to work on in the last couple of months, is what explains the difference in structure between these water isotope records among the core sites. And I have two hypotheses that I'm going to try and test. The first is that these different ice core records exhibit different seasonality, so that perhaps one record, such as Eclipse, has a lot of snowfall in the winter, so that has a wintertime bias toward what is being recorded in the isotope record. Whereas perhaps another record might have a summertime bias, and that explains the difference. Another hypothesis is that each of these sites are at slightly different altitudes, and that because of their difference in elevation, they represent a different air mass source catchment. So these records might be representing different spatial regions across the Pacific. So those are the two hypotheses. One, differences in sort of the spatial catchment, and two, differences in seasonality. So I'll first address the seasonality hypothesis. So one thing that we're lucky to have here on Denali is a really highly resolved record. So we have multiple samples per year. So we cannot, not only can we resolve annual variations in water isotopes. So here I'm showing you what you would do if you were just to take the average annual isotope value for each of these years here. And then if you string them together, you can show what they would look like plotted up. And that was what I showed you essentially in the previous graph. But you could also go through and pick all the maxima and make a time series of that. And that would give you information about what's going on specifically during the summertime. You could do the same during the winter. And they would give you additional different time series that are now specifically focused on the summer versus winter time. So when I do this and compare it to Eclipse, which we know has snowfall that falls primarily in the winter, as opposed to Denali, which has snowfall that falls kind of year round. If we compare specifically the wintertime Denali record with the Eclipse record, they actually match up, not perfectly, as you can see, they match up pretty well, especially given all the uncertainties that go into producing an ice core record. The correlation is not huge, but is very significant. And it explains a lot of the variability just by pulling out the wintertime season. It's exactly what we'd expect also, given the fact that we know that most eclipse snow falls in the winter. So it's a good bet that a lot of the discrepancy we can see, at least between Eclipse and Denali, is related to the sort of seasonal bias of wintertime snow at Eclipse. Unfortunately, we can't really do this yet with Mount Logan because that was sampled, the snowfall in Mount Logan is much lower in amount than it is at Eclipse and Denali. So we need to go back and basically get more snow from Logan to test this hypothesis there. I also want to add that I have filtered this time series to basically remove, with a bandpass filter, to remove basically the red noise, the overall long-term trend, as well as the white noise and the short-term trend, to really focus on this multi-decadal to centennial variability. To address the different spatial catchments of each core, I conducted some modeling using a high split back trajectory tool, which many of you are familiar with, but basically it simulates using the meteorology where the actual packets of air arriving at each site would have come from. So this is a simulation showing the different trajectories sort of moving backwards through time from all 3 ice core sites and where they would have come from. So I ran trajectories at each one of these sites showing the path of each packet of air to our ice core site every 6 hours for the last 41 years. So a total of 60,000 different trajectories and I don't know how many million data points. But it provides a real wealth of information that you can then compare to either your ice core record or different climate phenomenon or temperature, precipitation, or reanalysis fields, really anything you like. It's a really wonderful tool. So if I basically just stack all of them together, this is what they look like for Denali. So the hotter the colors, the more common the source of that air. And of course, right at the core site, you see it, this bullseye of red. And then within each contour, that sort of tells you that 50% of all of the air arriving at Denali within 10 days sort of comes from within this 50% contour. 90% arriving at the core site from within 10 days comes from within this 90% contour. So here's Denali, and as you can see, as you might expect, you've got a preference for the North Pacific as the source region. And here's Eclipse. It looks pretty similar. There are a few subtle differences, and here's Logan. I'll just flip back and forth real quick so you can sort of see the subtleties. Logan is the highest altitude site, and as you might guess, it has the most far-reaching set of trajectories, whereas Eclipse is the lowest altitude site and has sort of the most local set of trajectories, but all of them are sort of concentrated here around the Gulf of Alaska. If I essentially subtract all of these to get you the difference, it looks like this. So each of these colors represents the sort of bias of each site towards a particular region. So all the areas in green are the areas that are disproportionately represented in the Denali core. All the areas in red are disproportionately represented in Eclipse, and all the areas in blue are disproportionately represented in Mount Logan. So essentially there's a more Arctic-like signal in Denali, a more North America-like signal in Eclipse, and a more tropical Asia-like signal in Mount Logan. So if you were to see, say, a feature in Mount Logan that you don't see in the other cores, I would argue that there's a good bet that it involves some process occurring out here in either the tropics or subtropics or the Asian region. So this is another sort of clue of where we could take some of these analyses. Now, unfortunately, that is as far as I've gotten so far, and I know this probably opens up more questions than it does answer them, but just to summarize, the Denali record appears to be annually representative and can be separated into both summer and winter time series, whereas Eclipse is winter biased, which means that we can reconcile the Denali and Eclipse isotope records just based on seasonality, or at least get closer. And we don't yet know for Logan. For the air mass sources, all sites we know draw from the North Pacific Ocean. And each one of them, though, has different biases depending on their separate catchments. And then we can then, hopefully in the future, apply some of these conclusions towards interpreting the differences in the actual structure of the records. And the last thing I want to say is that for this air mass trajectory work, I've also done the same analysis here in Orono. So if anybody has science questions that involve looking at, climate and air mass trajectories, I have those results sort of ready to go. So get in touch with me if that is useful for any of your work. So that's really all I have to present. I'm happy to take questions if there's any time. Thanks.
Okay, so we have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions for Dominic, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, Dominic. Could you briefly explain again how you find the seasonal bias?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry. I know I went through all this pretty quickly. For Eclipse, we have a weather station that actually records the amount of snowfall that falls during each given season. So we know Eclipse has a wintertime bias because we actually have basically a bunch of snow stakes there that we go and measure every year to record when the snow falls. And it was similar on Mount Hunter. We only had a weather station there for a few years, but that sort of recorded a year-round snowfall, whereas Eclipse and in the sort of the surrounding towns and that region generally, we know that the snowfall mostly occurs during the winter.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, Dom, thank you for that. Tell me, you described the record as having a bandpass filter on it, and can you tell me roughly how much power in the time series is removed by taking the bottom end and the top end of that bandpass out?
Not off the top of my head, but I could look into it pretty easily and email back to you.
Good.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know right off.
Good. Thank you.
I will say that, I think there is a lot more work to be done since these results are they stay significant, like whether I use, say, a 10-year to a 50-year bandpass filter, but then some other ones, they don't. So to really hone in on exactly what frequencies are shared between these time series, I think is going to be really important in determining the actual mechanisms for the shared similarity. And that's something I haven't gone through thoroughly enough to really say definitively.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Dominic. And next we have Brian McGill with his title Biodiversity and Climate Change, What Has Happened and What Will Happen. Brian, please.
Let's see, hopefully you're seeing a map of the northeastern US at this point. So yeah, I'm going to describe 3 recent papers I've been working on. The first 2 are with Kate Miller, who was a graduate student at UMaine. She did her PhD while she had a full-time job with the National Park Service. So you probably didn't see her on campus very much, but she's running the National Park Service inventory and monitoring program for the whole northeastern US. So they go out every year and sample biodiversity, and she's in particular has done a lot with climate change. So this is a simulation of trees shifting their range. You probably, this group in particular, I'm sure knows that the main response of species to climate change is shifting their geographic ranges, where on the map they live. And there's been a lot of work, just taking sort of a correlation with climate and predicting where things live 100 or 80 or 200 years from now. But this was an effort to really, one of my interests has been, well, you actually do have to get there from here. And that in particular, that process of getting to where shifting to track climate looks very, very different in this modern human modified landscape than it has in the past. We've had about 14 major glacial cycles over the last couple million years, and almost, well, as far as we know, one species of tree went extinct because they're very effective at tracking. But now they're moving through a landscape with tar roofs and blacktop all over the place that are not such friendly places for trees to land. So this is an attempt to analyze this. This was done on a 90-meter scale, so sub-kilometer resolution across the northeastern US. It was very computationally intensive, but the land cover product from Landsat is at 90 meters. So we took real, this is spatially explicit, it's attached to real space, and we took real land cover into this, and then some detailed variation between species in their dispersal and life history parameters. And so what this graph is showing, the three species, if you probably can't read them, are shagbark hickory, mockernut hickory, and American holly. These are all species found in southern New England that are not maybe just make their way into Maine, but are not particularly Maine species right now, but should be in Maine 50 years from now, just judged by climate. And so the increasingly dark shades of, well, the yellow is places where, according to climate, it should be wanting to grow. I think it's 100 years from now. The gray is places that were considered unsuitable landscape types for this tree to grow. Much of it is blacktop, but I think it includes suburbs and some other areas like that. And green is where it's found today, and the blue is where it manages to disperse. And as you can see, the darker blue colors is where it's dispersing by about 100 years from now. So, this shouldn't be surprising. Trees don't move very fast. They land and they have to grow for 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years before they put out seeds again. But these are all examples of trees that are pretty much dispersing at a maximal rate, which I will make concrete in a minute. But they're not appearing to be dispersal. They're not jumping to the climate immediately, but they're also not dispersal limited. It seems as if they're going to get there to the climate. However, here are some other trees that are not doing so well. So that's sweet gum, loblolly pine, southern red oak, and willow oak. As you can tell, these are all more southern trees. Their current ranges is kind of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, maybe Pennsylvania, Delaware. And the blue is where they actually disperse, given the human landscape that they're dispersing into. The red is how far they would, you can see this map is zoomed in, so the spatial scale is a little finer than it was on the last one. The red is where it would disperse if we took away all the human landscape. So you can see that these are experiencing significant dispersal deficits. Indeed, many of them are barely even, 1 or 2 kilometers over the 80-year time horizon of this paper. And they're just not measuring their potential. And this was a general pattern. We found the trees that are already north of Boston are able to disperse quite well. Again, it takes time to disperse, but probably not, they're dispersing slower probably than climate change, but they're able to disperse fully. But these trees that are south of the megalopolis that goes from Washington, DC to Boston are just hitting way too much human population density to be able to disperse. And these trees are unlikely to be able to track climate change and disperse to where climate would suggest they should be growing. This graph is a little complicated, but it's kind of the most compact summary. So again, yellow is habitat that's open to disperse into, that's climatically suitable in the future. The gray is unsuitable habitat due to human land use. And the blue is dispersal, but in this case, the shades of blue have changed meaning. The shades of blue depend on the power of the long distance dispersal. You may know the story about how most dispersal is short distance, tens of meters, but occasionally you get long dispersal distance, hundreds or meters or even kilometers, and that's really what drives the rate of dispersal. So the dark blue is the longest dispersal, long distance dispersal events. And the blue line, sorry, not the blue line, the black lines are the null model where the bad habitat is taken out. And it really tells the same, but this gives you a sense of the distance from the current range. So some of these species that are north of Boston and not experiencing severe habitat, like those three that I showed you up at the top, are coming pretty close to tracking the knoll model. They're getting 50 kilometers in the time period modeled, but some of these species, the second row that's south, are just barely even advancing. And you can see compared to the knoll models, they're not moving forward at all. So there's some severe questions about dispersing through the Northeast megalopolis from DC to Boston. This is another paper that I think to some degree shows why that's true. It's in addition to the land cover. So this is a paper that went out and looked at 3 life stages: seedling, sapling, and adult of trees. Canopy, it looked at canopy trees and their seedlings, saplings, and adults. And the figure on the left is sapling density. And we do not know what is a regenerative level of sapling density, right? You have to have a certain number of saplings to replace adult trees as they fall. We have some ballpark estimates, but that's actually not a number that foresters have worked out in a lot of detail. But it almost doesn't matter because those gray areas essentially have no saplings at all to be found. So it's almost like there's a bomb that went off and that Northeast megalopolis just has no reproductive trees at all. The map for seedlings looks very similar. The other thing we did is we looked at species composition. So if there are seedlings or saplings, are they the same thing as the adult trees or are they different? And what you can see is up in Maine, northern New England, they're actually pretty similar. So the forest is currently regenerating, right? The maples and beeches that we have up here a little north of us, the pines and firs and spruces are dropping seeds and getting seedlings. But the very few seedlings and saplings that we do have in this middle northeast section are completely different from the parent trees, which could be good or it could be bad, right? It could be a sign of climate adaptation or it could be a sign of human impacts modifying the forest composition. And I'm going to argue it's the second, does not appear to be. So we just, this is a regression, spatial regression, car regression, looking at a bunch of different factors and what's explaining on the top seedling density and sorry, it's mislabeled on the bottom, sapling density. And you can see that for seedlings, climate change is actually a pretty big negative predictor, but some other factors like land cover, land use change, human modification, the percentage of invasive species and deer density are all significantly negatively impacting seedling density. It's largely a similar story for saplings as well. So it's one of these stories of many simultaneous factors happening at the same time. So climate change, land use change, land cover change, invasive plants, shrubs primarily, and overly dense deer are all contributing to this story. But again, the story is just really there is no forest regeneration happening over a significant swath of the eastern U.S. And what is happening is typically not. It's not climate adaptive, which is what I argued in the last paper, and it's also not replacing what small amounts there are is not replacing the trees. It's a shift in composition. So these forests are just well, almost completely being destroyed by humans. They're still there because trees live a long time, but their future looks very grim. Okay, switch to a totally different topic. This is on a global scale. This was a big paper that came out of a working group of about 25 people and worked on a data set that I and some others have been pulling together for 15 years on plant abundances around the world, plant survey data. And this is sort of the bottom line or money figure. So you see on the x-axis, the amount of land that's been set aside for conservation purposes. And you see that vertical line at 17%. That's the global average land conservation right now, 17%. And you see on the y-axis, the percent of species that are at risk. And this is actually for mammals. Percentage of species, actually it's for plants and mammals, trees and plants and mammals. The percentage of species that are at extinction risk, and I won't go through the whole model, but it involves predicting range shifts and then looking at the amount of area gained or lost, and then running that through a species area relationship as a predictor for species extinction risk. And you can see these curves differ by region, and these curves differ by different climate change scenarios. But the headline was getting to 30% reduces the risk of extinction by a factor of about 50%. So this is a major, the last paper identified land use change. Well, both the last two papers identified land use change as a really important factor. And this is the other extreme. If instead of building parking lots, we set aside conservation land, we can significantly, again, the headline is 30% set aside when we're already at 17. So it's only 13% more set aside for conservation can reduce the risks of extinction by climate by about 50%. So last slide here, just want to tell you about a current project that's going on. I'm the PI on it, but it's one of these EPSCoR Track 2. So it's got the University of Vermont and UMaine Augusta as part of it. We've ended up calling it Barracuda, even though the acronym doesn't work out perfectly, but it's basically biodiversity in rural communities, responding and adapting to climate change using data analysis. That was part of the call, is there had to be a strong data analysis component. So we've got three major themes, and this is about half a year into a 4-year project. So we've got 3.5 more years to go. And Bailey, who I think I saw on the call, is part of this project. Theme 1 is the predicting responses of we've never come up with a good word for this, but outdoor organisms, right? Organisms that are significantly interacting with the climate. So not crops like corn or something which are very heavily managed, but things that are long-lived and strongly interacting with climate. And predicting, the novel part, these predictions, as you've seen in some of the things I've already talked about, have been predicted where they're going to be 100 years from now or 200 years or 80 years from now, but that's not a very policy or management relative time scale. So we're really trying to up the game and make predictions in the 10, 20, 30 year decadal time scale and at a 1 kilometer spatial scale. And so we're really having to incorporate some of these issues of the landscapes that they're moving through, what the dispersal processes are. We're increasingly having to get into phenology and some of these kinds of things and make a much more complicated mechanistic model that's doing, it's kind of ironic that to predict at short time scales, you have to get really complicated mechanistic processes, and at long time scales, you can just do a really quick, simple correlational analysis, but that's how it's going in this field. And we're doing birds and trees with conservation and cultural implications, but we're also trying to focus on some of these outside organisms that are impacted by climate. So some crops like wild blueberries are clearly very heavily climate dependent. Fruit trees are long-lived and very clearly heavily climate dependent. Hay fields, which is really big in Vermont, very directly tied to the climate. And quite a few of the pests, the weeds, the diseases, pathogens, and also some human diseases, the zoonotic diseases like Lyme's disease, West Nile, equine encephalitis, all have a strong climate dependency. So we're working in all these areas. These changes have big impacts on humans. We're specifically looking at agriculture and farming and the rural community response to these changes, right? So there's adaptation, specifically range shifting primarily in the climate, in the natural world or the semi-natural agricultural world. And then there's a rural human response, rural community human response to these changes. So we have some social scientists looking at the human response. And then we're looking at improving some spatial temporal data tools, data science tools. I don't know about you, but well, I know the climate folks work a lot with spatial temporal data stacks, right? Where you have a raster, 2-dimensional spatial, and you have a time series. And I know there are files like NetCDF, but ecologists really have not been able to uptake and work with these kinds of spatial temporal data stacks as well as they could. They're, quite frankly, NetCDF is just too complicated for the average ecologist. So we're really looking to wrap that up and make it more accessible to ecologists. And then we have a stakeholder engagement component, which includes literally just stakeholder engagement and making sure they're involved in our research and co-producing research, but also some psychology, communication psychology questions about how to communicate complex spatial temporal predictions, which is basically what we're doing. And there's a workforce development component in spatial temporal data science training that spans from upward bound programs for high school students all the way through undergraduates, graduates, and faculty. So that's going on for the next 3.5 years, and I'd be happy to talk more about that. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So it's questions time. If anyone has any question for Brian, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hey, Brian, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
When you're talking about the eastern forests and the lack of regeneration, is that lack of regeneration of existing taxa or lack of any regeneration at all? I.e., are we seeing, is this like another way of saying there's turnover happening because we're not getting recruitment from the existing populations, or but new things are coming in, or like, you know, is this thermophilization, or is this like just we're not seeing recruitment, period?
It's both. So, and they seem to be correlated. In places like Upper New England, we're seeing significant recruitment, and the recruitment is actually very substantially similar to the canopy, which long-term may be a sign of non-adaptation to climate change, right? The current forest is regenerating so strongly that new species are not moving in. In this other region between DC and New York and kind of west out to, you know, Buffalo and Ohio, we're seeing both things happening. We're seeing almost no recruitment, and the recruitment that's happening is completely different from the canopy trees. It's a little bit got this messification, you know, oaks moving in, oaks fading out because things, precipitation, but, and I don't know that we've quantified this in a hard way, but it's a lot about, well, what a forester would call a junk tree, right? It's about weedy trees replacing traditional large canopy over trees.
And do you know, like, have you thought at all about, I'm just wondering about things like, especially in places like you're talking about Ohio or parts of the Midwest, like, do you know if invasive earthworms or deer or other kinds of biotic interactions could be playing a role?
So we haven't looked at earthworms. Deer are very definitely part of the story. And invasive species. Kate's done some other work in this National Park Monitoring Network, which pretty much matches this region. Woody shrubs are really exploding in the same area. So it seems like the woody shrubs are, invasive woody shrubs are a significant problem. Deer are a significant problem. Climate change and land use are problems. We haven't looked at, so all of the above. It's kind of, you know, abiotic, biotic, human, biotic, natural, biotic, invasive. We haven't looked at earthworms though. That would be an interesting one to look at too.
I think they're like a threat multiplier in these forests, right? They're like doing things to the litter layer and soils that seem to facilitate buckthorn and other things expanding. So
I don't know if there's a good data set on earthworm invasion density.
I'll think I knew some people at Wisconsin who were working on that, and I'll see if there's something like that.
Yeah, it'd be fun to throw that in. Even the deer, was actually really hard to get a comprehensive and comparable across space data set for deer. But yeah, it would be fun to throw earthworms in too.
Okay, Brian, there is one more question in chat. I will read for you. It's from Cindy, and she's asking about, can you say a bit more about why the focus on outdoor organisms, particularly given the importance of managed species for communities?
Yeah, for sure. Managed crops are very important for these communities. That's just not what we felt like we had the expertise and background to tackle. There is a whole, as I'm sure many people here know, you know, mini industry of building crop models and modeling specific crop responses to climate change. We just felt like that's not something we had the expertise to add to. And we also felt like some of these, you know, looking at some of the pests and pathogens and invasive species have been an understudied area relative to the crop models. I think another factor is that, you know, the timescales we're looking at, it's quite likely that these things that are directly responding to climate, right, we're going to manage the response of whatever it is, corn, over the short term, over this 10, 20, 30-year timescale. Because they're so heavily managed, we're probably going to be able to continue to manage them over those timescales, where some of the pests and pathogens are going to probably have larger changes and variations over that kind of timescale that we're looking at. So definitely not, you know, discounting the importance of the crops themselves. It's just not what we're experts at, and there are other experts kind of tackling that problem right now.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions for Brian? Okay, thank you both, two presenters. Those were really interesting topics, and I will just hand it over to Dan, who will close today's session with his closing remarks. Have a great week and see you all the next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, interesting talks as usual. Dom talked about his field work, which, as his second slide showed, is intense. He's starting to get his feet wet using stable isotopes to study core questions about unstable glaciers in Alaska. And as he becomes more seasoned in this research, he's attempting to explain the differences in the isotopic record across nearby cores with two hypotheses. One hypothesis is really spaced out, and in the other hypothesis, Dom is appropriately contemporary in trying to account for bias. Brian's work sees the forests and the trees over the next 100 years in the Northeast. Some species will be able to branch out more successfully than others, in large part due to human disturbance of the landscape. That is, some will be able to turn over a new leaf, while others will fall behind. Their propagation will be truncated. Brian presented two other projects, but too quickly to come up with a good punchline. Thank you all, and see you in a week.